So this morning we are looking at the Transfiguration. It's a principal feast in the church's year, although it was yesterday. But some of us were at Synod, and we didn't really talk about Transfiguration there. It wasn't officially celebrated in the Eastern Church until the 9th century, and in the Western Church until the 15th century. And as we've just heard, the story of the Transfiguration is when Jesus took Peter, James and John up a mountain. We don't know which mountain. And before they knew it, Moses and Elijah were both with Jesus, and Jesus became dazzling white. Peter, obviously, said something inappropriate, as Peter does. Then a cloud descended over them and a voice said, "This is my Son, my chosen one. Listen to him." There have been many interpretations of this significant event over the church's long history. So why is this event so important? It is recorded in all three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, which points to its importance. But what does this event mean for us today? Now, obviously, we can't explore everything, but I've made a few observations for us to think about. Now, there were some questions whether this event actually truly happened, or was it a story made up to teach us something? But being in the three Gospels, it tends to point to an important historical event. And the reason why this is important, that it is an historical event, is that what Jesus did, he actually did on earth. It isn't merely a story alone, like we hear in 1 Peter's reading, but an account of an actual event. Just like we could say Jesus' baptism. It actually happened. It's important that it's an historical event because our faith isn't based just in stories or ideals, but reality. And there is this deep, mystical connection between the world and the spirit, the temporal and the eternal, the seen and unseen, we could say. The second thing we could remember is that it marks the beginning of Jesus' final journey towards Jerusalem and of his greatest challenge. In all three accounts, Jesus is talking about his death to come. Then there is this deep sense of utter determination and focus as Jesus makes his way to Jerusalem. And the utter horror Jesus was to face is unimaginable for us to even begin to comprehend. We are talking about a divine, eternal being facing the reality of death. The only way we can begin to grasp the slightest appreciation of this is when we as mortal beings lose a loved one to death. But it never really can compare to what the Trinity faced, because there the immortal dies. The third thing, it has been said that Moses represented the Old Covenant law, and Elijah, the Old Covenant prophets. And in Christian circles, we often hear that the New Testament supersedes anything from the Old Testament. I don't know if you've heard that before. May have. But this isn't the case. Jesus' own words declare that he didn't come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come, he said, not to abolish, but to fulfill. And so as I was preparing this sermon up high in the bell tower, a question came to me. What did the law and the prophets try to fulfill? Was it for people to be perfect? To be civilized? To act and look exactly the same? I'll leave that question for you to ponder a bit. What did the law and the prophets try to fulfill? And what did Jesus succeed in doing? On the mountain, Jesus hadn't yet achieved his earthly purpose just yet. But it seems that this transfiguration shows us a foretaste of the transformation of life. In some ways, it sort of reminds us of Moses coming down Mount Sinai and having to veil his face because it shone so brightly. Encounter with God changes us. Perhaps not like Moses or Jesus, but there is a definite change that happens when we encounter God. However, this final stage of transformation, it also comes with a cost. It is so important to realize that the law and the prophets did not give people a free ride to do whatever they liked. People still needed to make decisions and choices about their life. The law and the prophets were to guide and to warn people. And we see that time and time again in the Old Testament. The book of Judges, the Kings, those who obeyed obeyed God, the law, and then things were going well, and then they decided to do what they liked, and things started to go bad, then very bad, then they repented and did what God wanted them to do, and then things went well, and then they decided to do what they liked, then things started to go bad, then really bad, then they repented, and so to obey God, then things started to go well, and then they decided to do whatever they liked, and then things started to go wrong, and then really wrong, then they repented. You'll sort of see that pattern happen. I'm not going to say that again. But in exactly the same way, the grace of God found in Jesus Christ doesn't give us a free ride to do whatever we want to do, where we sit back and let God do everything for us, to, in some ways, create God as a genie for our beck and call, to get us that car park outside the shop. But in Nelson, that's not too hard because there's normally a car park outside the shop, so it's not too bad. There is work and effort, sacrifice and service needed for us to experience the goodness of God. Now I want to repeat that again because I think all you probably heard was the first part, and the second part is important. There is work and effort, sacrifice and service needed for us to experience the goodness of God. To experience the goodness of God. Focus on that part more than the sacrifice and service. And so the decisions and the choices that we make are so important. And we know that our faith does require effort, and sometimes the sacrifice can be demanding. But like the determination of Jesus to the higher goal, and that of countless followers after Jesus, we too need to keep our eyes on the ultimate prize of why we are here, why God has called us. To understand why we do what we do. Why do we forgive people when they hurt us, when we don't want to? Why are we generous with the wealth that we have? Why do we care for those who can't seem to look after themselves? Indeed, why do we get up early on a Sunday morning when it is very cold and come and worship? Hopefully it's more than just to see me, although that is a pretty good reason why, but there should be more. Bit too much sniggering there, I think. The words of God are important here in this account. They seem to be like the bookends of Jesus' ministry in some ways. At his baptism, we have this voice saying, "You are my son, my beloved. With you I am well pleased." And then we have these words, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." Now the Greek word for listen here also includes obey. It is what husbands do when they listen to their wives. They don't just listen, they obey. That's when a wife says something to her husband, he hears it, immediately does it. Okay. So the transformation of our life and the faith is only possible through listening and obeying. If we simply listen, then we fool ourselves and we miss out on all the joy, the blessings that obedience brings us. It's like what was said in James, when you look in a mirror and you forget what you look like. It's like when you listen but don't obey. But as we saw with Israel, it's not only that we miss out on the blessings when we obey, we also can end up in trouble. The only reason that Israel failed in their call from God is because they didn't obey God, to hear and to do. And the law and the prophets were to warn and encourage people to obey God, to hear and to do. Because in terms of what it gives our life, there is nothing better. When we actually do what Jesus tells us to do, it makes our life so much better than anything else. Even though the world may tell us that, you don't have to forgive that person. You don't have to give money to those people who can't look after themselves. It's their own fault. You should stay in bed and not worship. It's nice and warm there. Just on a side note, the heaters in the cathedral are on and have been on since 7:30, and they're still on to the very end. Unless you stay too long, then I'm turning them off. The words recorded by God in all three Gospels are pretty clear. God says, listen to him. Listen, obey. Is this what the law and the prophets were to achieve and what Jesus fulfilled? Because the real battle that we have isn't outside this place. The real battle that we have is within ourselves. The battle we choose whether we want to obey or not, to take up our cross and follow Christ or not. The daily battles we make each day over the choices that we make. And those small everyday battles are far more important than the big things that sometimes come across our path. In fact, like I said last week in regard to our faith, it is the small, easy things in life that reveal our faith. When we can be faithful in those small things, the bigger things will be a breeze. In exactly the same way, how we obey, how we listen and do what God wants us to do in the small things dictates the bigger things. So let me conclude with the words that God said. Listen to him. Jesus is the light. Listen to him. For Jesus is the truth. Listen to him. Jesus is the way to the Father. Listen to him. For Jesus is Lord. Listen to him. Jesus is the light of the world, the bread of life, the good shepherd. Jesus is the resurrection and the life. Listen to him and find rest from your burdens, healing from your past, and hope for your future. Amen.